Study of communities involves quantifying key attributes of how species are interacting in food chains and food webs. Considering how some species are more important than others to the dynamics of structuring. Up to this point, the focus has been on interactions that occur between two species. But in a community, each species interacts with dozens or even thousands of other species within a defined area. The resulting complexity of interactions is overwhelming. How can biologists begin to characterize communities? In general, a community structure has four key attributes. First, the total number of species. Second, the relative abundance of those species. Third, the sum of interactions among all species. And fourth, the physical attributes of the community, which may include abiotic factors such as geographic size or altitude gradients. And biotic factors also, such as the physical structure provided by the primary vegetation type, as in a forest or a grassland. Some species can have very large effects on the structure of a community. The presence of a particular plant can have a huge effect on community structure, such as the presence of redwood trees in a redwood forest. Removal of these structural species by harvesting, disease, competition with an invasive species, or climate change, or other factors can cause dramatic changes to community structure. The presence of certain consumers can also have an enormous impact on the species present. The structure of an entire community can change dramatically if a single species of predator or herbivore is added or removed from a community. Let's consider an experiment that Robert Payne conducted in intertidal habitats of the Pacific Northwest of North America. In this environment, the sea star Pisaster ocraceus is an important predator. Its preferred food is the California mussel, Mytilus californianus. When Payne removed P. ocraceus sea stars from experimental areas, what had been diverse communities of algae and invertebrates became overgrown with solid strands of mussels. M. californianus mussel is a dominant competitor, but its populations had been held in check by sea star predation. The graph shows the number of species present in experimental plots where P. ocraceus was present or excluded. When the predator was absent, the species richness of the habitat changed radically. To capture the effect that a predator such as P. ocraceus can have on a community, Payne coined the term keystone species. A keystone species has a much greater impact on the distribution and abundance of the surrounding species than its abundance would suggest. Sea stars are not just affecting their prey, they are also indirectly affecting many other species that interact with their prey. The impacts of a species on a community can be visualized in terms of a food web, a network of exchanges of energy and nutrients among producers, consumers, and decomposers in an ecosystem. Food webs focus only on feeding interactions, not all types of species interactions, but are central to the structure of communities. So, the sea star pisaster is considered a keystone species in some intertidal areas. Since when pisaster was removed from experimental areas, the number of species present and the complexity of the habitat changed radically. Once biologists had a basic understanding of how species interact and how communities are structured, they turned to questions about how community dynamics change through time. Community composition and structure may change radically in response to changes in abiotic and biotic conditions. Biologists have become particularly interested in how communities respond to disturbance. A disturbance is any strong, short-lived disruption to a community that changes the distribution of living and/or non-living resources. Forest fires, windstorms, floods, the fall of a large canopy tree, disease epidemics, and short-term explosions in herbivore numbers all qualify as disturbances. These events are important because they alter light levels, nutrients, unoccupied space, or some other aspect of resource availability. Biologists have come to realize that the impact of disturbance is a function of three factors: the type of disturbance, its frequency, and its severity. For example, the speed and duration of a flood or the intensity of heat during a fire. Biologists have also come to realize that most communities experience a characteristic type of disturbance. In most cases, disturbances occur with a predictable frequency and severity. Biologists refer to a community's disturbance regime. For example, fires kill most of the existing trees in a boreal forest every 100 to 300 years on average. In contrast, many small-scale tree falls, usually caused by windstorms, occur in temperate and tropical forests every few years. Severe disturbances remove all or most of the organisms from an area. The recovery that follows is called succession. The name was inspired by the observation that species with certain types of life history strategies tend to succeed others over time. Primary succession occurs when a disturbance removes the soil and its organisms, as well as organisms that live above the surface. Glaciers, floods, volcanic eruptions, and landslides often initiate primary succession. Secondary succession occurs when a disturbance removes some or all of the organisms from an area but leaves the soil intact. Fire and logging are examples of disturbances that initiate secondary succession. How does recovery proceed after a severe disturbance? This figure shows a typical sequence of plant communities that develops as secondary succession proceeds. First, though, let's consider primary succession, imagining a landscape before primary succession begins, like near a volcano. The process of soil building begins with solid rock, which weathers over time to produce gravel and sand, silt, and clay. As organisms occupy the substrate, they add dead cells and tissues and feces. With time, soil eventually becomes a complex and dynamic mixture of inorganic particles, organic particles, and living organisms that enable plants to take root and add structure to the landscape. During secondary succession, soil is already present. Early successional communities are dominated by species that are short-lived, small in stature, and disperse their seeds over long distances. Late successional or climax communities are dominated by species that tend to be long-lived, large, and good competitors for resources such as light and nutrients. The particular sequence of species that appears over time is called a successional pathway. Three factors determine the pattern and rate of species replacement during succession at a certain time and place. First, the particular traits of the species involved. For example, pioneering species, the first organisms to arrive at a newly disturbed site, tend to be weedy. A weed is a plant that is adapted for growth in disturbed soils. Because soil is often disturbed when biomass is removed, weeds tend to thrive at the start of succession. Second, how the species interact. During succession, existing species can have one of three types of effect on subsequent species. Facilitation takes place when the presence of an early arriving species makes abiotic conditions more favorable for the arrival of certain later species, such as by providing shade or nutrients. Tolerance is when existing species do not affect the probability that subsequent species will become established. Inhibition occurs when the presence of one species inhibits the establishment or regrowth of another. Finally, historical and environmental circumstances, such as the size of the area involved and weather conditions. For example, the communities that developed after forest fires disturbed Yellowstone National Park in 1988 depended on the size of the burned patch and how hot the fire had been at that location.